this episode, we start by treating privacy training as a real control that changes behavior, because beginners often assume training is just something organizations do to satisfy a requirement rather than to reduce risk. The CDPSE exam expects you to understand training and awareness as an operational mechanism that makes privacy decisions consistent across many people, many teams, and many moments of pressure. A privacy program can have strong policies and well-written procedures, but if staff do not understand what personal information is, what rules apply, and what to do when something feels wrong, then privacy outcomes become random. Training also matters because privacy work is distributed, meaning product teams, engineers, support staff, procurement, and leadership all touch decisions that affect personal information even if they do not think of themselves as privacy professionals. The goal is not to turn everyone into a privacy expert, but to build reliable habits, shared vocabulary, and clear escalation paths so that people act correctly without needing to pause and guess. Awareness is the reinforcement layer that keeps those habits alive over time, especially as staff changes and systems evolve. By the end, you should be able to explain what effective privacy training looks like, why it matters to risk reduction, how it should work at a high level, and how to make it stick in real workflows rather than fading after a single annual module. A useful first step is understanding why training fails so often, because the exam is likely to reward solutions that address real failure modes rather than idealized goals. Training fails when it is generic, because people cannot see how it applies to their daily decisions, and generic training is quickly forgotten. Training fails when it is too long and dense, because learners tune out and retain almost nothing, even if they can complete the course. Training fails when it is treated as a compliance checkbox, because teams focus on completion rather than behavior change. Training also fails when policies are not aligned with actual system behavior, because people notice the mismatch and stop trusting the guidance. Another common failure is training that does not include practical escalation steps, so staff might recognize a problem but not know who to tell or what is expected, which leads to silence and delayed response. Privacy training can also fail when leadership does not reinforce it, because people follow what leaders prioritize, and if leaders only praise speed and output, privacy gets treated as friction. The exam often tests maturity by asking what makes a program effective in the real world, and training design is a strong signal of maturity. When you understand failure modes, you can design training that anticipates them and builds in reinforcement rather than hoping people remember. Effective privacy training begins with a clear purpose statement, because without a purpose, training becomes a list of facts instead of a behavior-shaping control. The purpose is to ensure people can recognize personal information in context, apply privacy principles to decisions, follow operational procedures for rights and incidents, and understand their role-specific responsibilities. This is important because privacy risk often comes from small, routine actions like sharing a dataset for analysis, copying data into a test environment, or adding a vendor tool without review, and those actions are performed by people who may not realize the privacy implications. A training program should therefore focus on decision points, meaning moments where a person must choose an action that either aligns with privacy controls or bypasses them. The exam expects you to understand that training must connect to policies and procedures, because training is how policies become executable knowledge. Training should also create a shared vocabulary, so people can communicate clearly when an issue arises, like being able to say a dataset contains personal information or a use change may violate purpose limitation. Another critical purpose is escalation readiness, meaning people know what constitutes a privacy incident and how to report it quickly. When training has a clear purpose tied to decision points, it becomes much easier to make it effective and measurable. Role-based training is one of the most practical ways to make training stick, and the exam often rewards this concept because it demonstrates an understanding of how organizations actually work. Different roles face different privacy decisions, so they need different emphasis and examples. Product teams need training that helps them recognize when a feature introduces new data collection, new purposes, or new sharing relationships, and how to trigger assessments and documentation updates. Engineers need training that connects privacy principles to system behavior, such as minimization, access control, logging, retention, and handling personal information in test environments. Support teams need training on handling rights requests, identity verification, and avoiding improper disclosures during customer interactions. Procurement and vendor management teams need training on what privacy requirements must appear in contracts, what due diligence is needed, and when a vendor relationship changes scope. Leaders need training that helps them understand risk acceptance, accountability, and the importance of resourcing privacy controls rather than treating them as optional. Beginners sometimes assume one training module can fit everyone, but one-size training often becomes irrelevant for most learners. When training is role-based, people recognize themselves in the scenarios, which makes the content more memorable and more likely to influence behavior. For training to stick, it must be anchored in the actual workflows where privacy decisions happen, because memory is strongest when learning is tied to context. If a product team has a regular feature planning meeting, that meeting can include a moment where privacy considerations are reviewed, using simple prompts that mirror training concepts. If procurement has a vendor onboarding checklist, privacy requirements can be embedded into that checklist, reinforcing training every time a vendor is evaluated. If engineering has a change management process, the process can include triggers for privacy assessments when data flows or purposes change, reinforcing the idea that privacy is part of normal delivery. If support teams have ticket workflows, the workflow can include clear routing for rights requests and privacy incidents, reinforcing correct handling under time pressure. The exam expects you to understand that training is not separate from operations, because training that is never used in real work will not be remembered. Embedding training into workflows also helps because it reduces the need for people to recall everything from memory. The workflow provides prompts at the moment of need. Another benefit is that workflow embedding creates consistent behavior across teams because the same triggers and steps are repeated. When privacy training is reinforced by workflow design, it becomes a system-level control rather than an individual memory test. Awareness is different from training, and understanding that difference is important because many programs confuse them and then wonder why behavior does not change. Training builds foundational understanding and teaches how to perform specific tasks or make specific decisions. Awareness reinforces key concepts over time, keeps privacy visible, and reminds people of behaviors that matter, especially as new risks and new systems appear. Awareness can include short reminders about recognizing personal information, reminders about not using production data in test environments, reminders to report suspected incidents quickly, and reminders about handling requests through approved processes. The exam expects you to see awareness as a continuous reinforcement mechanism, not a once-a-year event. Awareness also supports culture by signaling that privacy is part of the organization's identity and values, and culture is a major driver of whether people follow controls when no one is watching. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking awareness is just posters and slogans, but effective awareness is tied to real decision points and real risks the organization is facing. Awareness can also be tailored to roles, like short targeted reminders for developers during release cycles or for support teams during peak request periods. When awareness is designed as reinforcement of specific behaviors, it increases retention and reduces drift over time. A practical training program also needs to address beginner misunderstandings explicitly, because misunderstandings create predictable errors that lead to incidents and noncompliance. One misunderstanding is thinking privacy is only about secrecy, when privacy also includes appropriate use, fairness, and honoring rights. Another misunderstanding is thinking personal information only includes obvious identifiers, when indirect identifiers and derived profiles can be personal information in context. Another misunderstanding is assuming encryption makes data not personal, when encryption is a safeguard but does not change the nature of the data. Another misunderstanding is assuming vendors solve privacy automatically, when vendor processing expands risk and requires oversight, contracts, and evidence. Another misunderstanding is treating consent as a universal solution, when consent must be meaningful, purpose-specific, and enforced, and in many contexts other lawful bases or obligations apply. A final misunderstanding is assuming incidents are always cyber attacks, when privacy incidents can be misdirected emails, misconfigurations, or inappropriate internal access. Training that names these misunderstandings and corrects them reduces the chance that learners will rely on wrong assumptions in high-pressure moments. The exam often uses scenario questions to test whether you can avoid these common misconceptions, so training that targets them supports both real-world performance and exam performance. Measurement is a key part of making training stick, because without measurement you cannot tell whether training is changing behavior or merely producing completion certificates. The exam expects you to think about training effectiveness as a risk control, meaning you should measure outcomes that relate to risk reduction, not only participation. Completion rates matter as a baseline, but they do not prove comprehension or behavior change. Better measures include reductions in repeated privacy errors, faster and more accurate escalation of incidents, improved correctness and timeliness in rights request handling, fewer cases of unnecessary data collection, and better compliance with vendor onboarding requirements. You can also measure knowledge through short comprehension checks, but those checks should be tied to practical decisions rather than trivia. Another useful measure is audit findings related to training, such as whether staff can explain procedures during interviews, because that indicates training is retained. The exam may test whether you recognize that training should be updated based on incidents and audit results, because training is part of continuous improvement. When measurement is tied to real operational outcomes, leaders can see value and invest in improvements. This makes training more sustainable, which is essential for making it stick over time. For training to remain consistent and effective as the organization changes, it needs governance and ownership, because otherwise it will drift, become outdated, or be skipped. A mature program defines who owns the training content, who approves updates, and how often content is reviewed. It also defines how training aligns with policies, procedures, and risk priorities, so changes in requirements lead to training updates. The exam may test this by describing an organization with outdated training that does not match current systems or current processing, and the correct answer often involves updating training and aligning it with operational reality. Training governance also includes onboarding processes, because new employees need training quickly and role changes require additional training when responsibilities change. Another part is ensuring training materials remain accessible and usable, because training that is hard to find or hard to understand will not be used. Governance can also include maintaining records of training completion as evidence, because training is often part of demonstrating accountability. A beginner misunderstanding is assuming training will stay correct once created, but privacy programs evolve, and training must evolve with them. When training has clear ownership and update processes, it can remain effective through organizational change. Training must also coordinate with other privacy program components, because training alone cannot compensate for broken processes or missing controls. If a rights request workflow is unclear, training cannot make it reliable. The workflow itself must be fixed, and training then teaches it. If vendor onboarding lacks required privacy review steps, training will not fix the structural gap. Procurement processes must include the gate, and training then explains how to use it. If incident reporting channels are confusing, training may raise awareness but still produce delayed escalation. The organization needs clear reporting mechanisms, and training then reinforces them. The exam expects you to understand this interaction because privacy engineering is a system of controls, and training is one control among many. Training is most effective when it is paired with job aids, clear procedures, and workflow prompts that support correct action in the moment. Training also benefits from leadership messaging and consistent enforcement, because people learn what matters by watching what gets attention and consequences. When training is integrated into a broader control system, it becomes sticky because learners see it used repeatedly and experience it as part of normal work. This is how awareness, culture, workflow, and governance combine to create durable behavior change. As we close, making privacy training and awareness stick in real teams and workflows means designing training as a behavior-changing control that is role-based, practical, and reinforced by the way work is done. Effective training starts with a clear purpose tied to decision points, builds role-specific understanding for product teams, engineers, support, procurement, and leaders, and addresses common misunderstandings that lead to predictable privacy failures. Awareness reinforces key behaviors over time and supports a privacy culture where people escalate issues early and treat personal information responsibly even under pressure. Embedding training concepts into workflows, such as product development gates, vendor onboarding processes, and rights request routing, turns learning into repeated action rather than a one-time memory test. Measurement focuses on real outcomes like fewer privacy errors, faster escalation, and better request handling, so training can be improved continuously rather than assumed effective. Governance keeps training current through ownership, review cycles, and alignment with policy and changing risk priorities, ensuring it survives organizational change. The CDPSE exam rewards this domain because privacy programs succeed when people consistently make correct decisions across many roles, and training and awareness are the practical tools that create that consistency. When you can explain how to design, embed, reinforce, and measure training, you demonstrate the kind of operational maturity that makes privacy risk management dependable over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.